you recording?
Yes, right now.
Oh my god, can we start?
Edit?
Yeah, can you edit
You
this?
can
Super
edit.
real. Okay, we'll go right there. Sorry, guys.
Jody?
Nathan James Brock accounted for.
Jaylee.
Tim?
And the baby.
Byron Miller.
And the baby. And the baby.
Rich? All right.
I'm Vanessa. I'll be giving an informative speech over the Bubonic Plague. It's 1347 in medieval Europe, and your neighbor walks by you on the street coughing. He's covered with lumps on his body, and he starts coughing up blood. What do you do? Run. Oh my god! Tim is judging me.
Oh.
Oh,
Don't do that.
That's Tim right there.
Right. All right, third time's
The
the
judge.
charm. Third time's the charm. Ready?
Jody.
Rich.
Tim's judging me.
Jody.
What do you need?
Nathan James Brock, present and accounted for.
Jaylee. And baby.
Tim? Byron?
Rich?
I'm Vanessa. I'm going to be doing an informative speech today over the Bubonic Plague. Imagine it's 1347 in medieval Europe. You're walking past one of your neighbors on the street and they're covered in lumps on their body and they start coughing up blood. What do you do? At this time, you most likely would not have known what those symptoms would have been, but you would have heard of the Great Pestilence. The Great Pestilence, otherwise known as the Black Plague, also known as the Bubonic Plague, was a disease that took over medieval Europe. It killed half of its population. We'll be discussing the symptoms, the treatments, and also some of the misconceptions of the bubonic plague today. First, we'll begin with our symptoms. The first symptom that would first appear would be flu-like symptoms, including coughing, sneezing, chills, body aches, weakness. These would usually occur 3 to 7 days after you had already been exposed to the bacteria. The next symptom, which is one of the more distinct symptoms of the bubonic plague, would be swollen tender lymph nodes. These occasionally would break open and emit pus and blood. These were something that would show up directly after your flu-like symptoms. You'd also be coughing up and or vomiting blood if you happen to contract the bubonic plague. At this point, antibiotics during modern day would most likely not help with the bubonic plague after you had hit this stage. Most of the victims of bubonic plague do contract gangrene in their extremities. These photos show gangrene and gives a perfect example as to why it was called the Black Plague. There are treatments modern day. Obviously, in medieval Europe, these treatments were not known. They looked more towards herbal healings. Things such as vinegar and water, rose water. The modern treatments today, the most effective is antibiotics. These antibiotics must be taken within 24 hours of showing any signs or symptoms, otherwise death is most likely to occur. Other forms of treatment do include receiving oxygen, IV fluids, and respiratory support. Those are usually just things that are used for comfort after a person has already passed the stages where antibiotics would happen to help them and cure the illness. There are some misconceptions about the bubonic plague. One of those, both here in modern day and in medieval times, was that people could contract it person to person. This is actually inaccurate. It's very unlikely that that would happen. The only way that that could possibly happen is if an infected article of clothing would happen to touch a person that had an open wound spot where that would touch. The most common form of transmittal is actually from prairie dogs to humans. In the modern day, these prairie dogs have been infected by fleas that carry the disease. A misconception that was more so in the medieval times rather than modern day was that this was a curse. Many villagers did believe that the reason that they had the plague was because they were being punished by God. If they could rid the city of sin, then they felt like they could then get rid of the plague. So anyone that they thought was a sinful person, they would try to banish from the city. Medieval Europeans did have a tendency to look towards the heavens and toward God for the reason for diseases such as this, rather than science. Had they looked at science, if it were around at that point in time, they would have discovered that it had nothing to do with sinners. It had to do with their living conditions, such as filthy streets. They had many rodents that were running around the streets that were actually the main carriers of the disease at that time. Why should you care, and how does it affect you? The plague has actually reoccurred several times since the outbreak in Europe in the 14th century, and it has affected almost every continent here on planet Earth. There are cases here in the United States each year. Anywhere from 5 to 15 people do contract the disease. Most people have a very low mortality rate when they contract the disease here in the United States. Diseases do have a tendency to change, mutate, and grow. Right now with the bubonic plague, some countries have noticed that some of their antibiotics are no longer as effective as they once were against the plague, just because it is learning how to mutate against those antibiotics. So just don't get too comfortable, and if the plague comes knocking at your back door, seek treatment immediately.
Hey.
I'm sorry if you wanted to.
Very good. Very good.